Welcome everyone to Africa in Perspective online conversations with David Anodiwana Chikwaza. My guest today is joining me from Victoria, South Africa, to holds a PhD in political science and is a member of South African Association of Political Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, our viewers, the topic under discussion today is Africa's fight for a seat, a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council. Background, ability, and prospects for success. Before we begin our conversation today, let me give our highly esteemed guests an opportunity to give us his opening remarks. Mr. Dylan, welcome to Africa in Perspective online conversations.
Thank you so much for having me. I think this is a community of practice where we share ideas and I'm hoping that we can be able to engage on some of these issues, particularly on Africa's foreign policy and Africa in the context of reforming or assimilating into the United Nations Security Council.
Wonderful, wonderful, Doc. Doc, how is Pretoria today?
No, Pretoria is okay. It was a bit cloudish during the day, but I'm suspecting that is because we are nearing winter, and we just pray that the winter comes with good blessings and tidings, and yes.
What wonderful, wonderful. Otherwise, how are you recovering from the lockdown? I understand that the lockdown was taking a toll on a number of people, a number of businesses. Many entities were affected, adversely impacted. So I don't know how are people recovering? How are businesses recovering?
I think the lockdown has been a challenge for most of us. And I think it has also been a lesson in terms of understanding how life and its dynamics unpack and unfold. As you may recall, that this is not the first time that the world has had to deal with a pandemic of such magnitude. It happened perspective in terms of introducing, whether it's in business, it's in politics, it's in church, to ensure this pandemic.
Definitely, definitely. It's good to hear some positive developments there. Doc, maybe to get into our discussion, into our conversation today. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you on this platform, in this conversation. The first question that I want to ask you is, many might have heard African leaders such as the late Robert Mugabe, and of course, recently the South African leader, Ramaphosa, and of course, even the Nigerian president, castigating the current UN system, calling for its reform. Maybe for someone who's not really acquainted with the United Nations and this fight for a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, could you be kind enough maybe to just tell us what is the background of Africa's fight for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council? Doc, did you hear my question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Did you hear my question? Did you hear my question?
Can you hear
Hello,
me?
Doc? Yes, I can hear you. Did you hear my question? Hello, Doc? Did you hear my question?
Can you hear me?
Hello, Doc, did you hear my question?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Did you hear my question?
Yes, I heard your question, and I say that you are raising a very interesting question, because
Yes.
I think the question about the reforming of the United Nations Security Council forms part and parcel of Africa's international relations. And I think this also falls into the global North versus South debates. It also falls into the prisms of affirmative action. So, as a student of international relations and politics, I think we have to understand the interaction between the domestic and external context. And the domestic context, basically, we are looking at the period through which African leaders, particularly President Robert Mugabe, President Thabo Mbeki, President Nkrumah, President Nyerere, they were raising these issues. One of the goals of foreign policy, obviously, is to extend a country's foreign interest in the external environment. So I think the call by African leaders was to say we need to democratize the international system. After having a bipolar system that the world was pitted against America and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and a unipolar system after 1990, the consensus, particularly around Africans, was that some of the issues that Africa is facing in the context of political aspiration and social objectives. That was the context through which you would find that the call to reform the United Nations Security Council.
Hello, Doc? Hello, Doc?
Can you hear me?
Doc. Doc. Hello, Doc. Hello, Doc.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please carry on.
Yes, yes. I think this one is I can hear you clearly with this one.
Oh, okay.
So can we continue now?
Yes, we can continue.
Yes. So I was basically saying that the context is that we need to understand the interaction between domestic and external context. Domestic in the sense that Africa was just emerging from colonialism.
Yes.
And as you would understand, that foreign policy is an extension of domestic interests. So we had leaders like President Robert Mugabe, President Beki, President Kwame Nkrumah, and President Julius Nyerere, for example, whose Marxist orientation dictated that they would translate their ideologies in an effort to democratize the international system, particularly international organizations such as the UN and also its extension, United Nations Security Council. So I think the question that I think would also bring to our viewers is how feasible is reforming the United Nations Security Council? Is it reforming or it's assimilating African states? And I guess in this discussion, we also had to look at the political, economic, and social aspects obtaining in most African states. And then we look at them and assess them against the background of whether we are ready and whether we have the capacity to enforce some sort of reform in the United Nations Security Council.
Yes. Yeah, I think those are very important questions. Those are very questions that you are pinpointing. It's in fact, it's like your insight of all questions that I was going to ask you. Maybe immediately going right to the issue of feasibility. How feasible is it to form or to assimilate the United Nations Council?
Well, it depends on which angle you are looking at it. Because if you understand that the discussion around reforming the United Security Council, I think falls into the prisons of foreign policy. And any serious study on foreign policy would obviously include theories of international relations. If you are looking at it from a realist point of view, you would understand that realists like E.H. Carr would argue to say that the state is the most important actor in international relations. By this, we are basically saying that the state is the only institution that holds currency, and international organizations hence are used instrumentally for the realization of foreign policy, are used instrumentally if we are looking at it from a personal level of analysis of maybe charismatic leaders. So in the context of realism, we are looking at assimilating African states because we don't hold much power, whether it is militarily, whether it is economically. And realists do not recognize the importance of international organizations such as the United Nations. Yes, they do accept that they exist, but they don't put primacy in terms of them shaping international affairs, simply on the basis that we do not have a world police that can be able to police states' actions, and states enter into these organizations on a voluntary basis. Secondly, if we are going to look at it from a liberalist point of view, where we are talking about the question of multilateralism, where we are saying, after particularly the the Cold War, we are looking at so many transnational issues that are involved: terrorism, global pandemics such as COVID-19. So there is that need for greater cooperation between states. And if we are going to infuse Clive Archer template on the roles of international organizations, you realize that scholars like Archer will tell you that international organizations serve the dual purpose of being arenas and instruments to realize foreign policy. But if you're also going to look at it from a Marxist perspective, which is very much instructive in terms of understanding world relations, you would then realize that the quest for reforming the United Nations Security Council falls within the prisms of the global north versus global south debates, whereby the capitalist north and the other underdeveloped third world regions of the world have this contentious ideological debate in terms of and symbiotic relations that is uneven, that needs to be reformed. So we are looking at international organizations being serving the purpose of being used as instruments for foreign policy objective by powerful states in the international system. So if it depends on how one looks at it. And you also need to take into account that the feasibility of the reforming of the United Nations Security Council also depend on our domestic politics. As you would understand, there's the old adage that says charity begins at home. And unfortunately, in Africa, it usually ends there. You look at some of the contentious political, economic, and social crises obtaining in Africa, we get a sense that Africa is not yet ready to get there, particularly on the fact that the first generation of leadership that we had, the nationalist leaders like President Robert Mugabe, President Kwame Nkrumah, and all these other nationalists whose ideological foundation and disposition was looking at a continental approach to democratizing the international system. Unfortunately, because identities are always in a constant state of mobility, they shift from time to time. We have entered a new era of second and third generation of leaders that look at Africa's place, not from a reformist point of view, but from an accommodative, inclusive, and multilateral point of view, that it's almost difficult for one to imagine whether the current crop of leadership that we have in Africa will be able to push for a reformed agenda of the United Nations Security Council. Okay.
Hello, Doc. Hello, Doc.
Yes.
Oh, did you hear my question?
Can you repeat it again? I think we had a challenge of network.
Okay. Okay, my question was, I was saying that you raised quite very important points there. You talked about the issue of different generation of leaders. You know, we are talking about the Nyereres, we're talking about the Nkurumas, we're talking about the Robert Mugabes, of which the majority, if not all of them, they're no longer on the scene. Many of them, they're no longer on the scene. And now you're pinpointing to the aspect of a new crop of leaders that maybe are taking a different approach to international, to this whole reform. They are saying maybe they can accommodate, we can accommodate maybe the way things are and try to fit in. So now the question, the $1 million question that I'm now asking you, in your opinion, do you think that Africa as a continent is ready to take a place, to take as a permanent seat in the UN Security Council? Because my understanding is, if you look back in 1945, maybe the countries, USA, China, Russia, France, all those five countries, ones that became the permanent members of the UN Security Council, maybe it was because of maybe the ability to actually shape international affairs, their capacity to shape international affairs. Looking at, for example, also looking at their hard power, their soft power, even their technological prowess and many other factors. Maybe it goes back to the issue of clear. Maybe in your view, what do you think should be the clear in terms of assessing whether or not Africa is ready to be given a seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council?
You see, as I said, that foreign policy, because the question of Africa's readiness to take a seat in the United Nations Security Council borders on our domestic policies and domestic politics. And if our domestic politics, for example, they do not reflect a commitment to democratic and forward-looking policies, I think it becomes a problem. If you look at what is happening right now in Southern Africa, you have a contentious political climate in Zimbabwe. You have a contentious political climate in South Africa. You also have a contentious political climate in Mozambique. When you go up the continent, in the Maghreb region, Libya, that was almost becoming Africa's first success story, is in ruins. You go to the Horn of Africa, it's the same thing. Now, the question that would be in everybody's mind tonight is that if, as Africans, we cannot get our houses in order, how is it that we are going to transport or export our political ecosystems in the international scene? And secondly, I think it also goes back to the issue that I was raising earlier on about the roles of international organizations. And I think Clive Archer, one of the most prolific and prominent scholars of international relations, has said it in terms of the roles of international organizations, where he says these sometimes serve as instruments. Now, instruments of what? Instruments of projecting the power of powerful states. Now, you'd recall that the US, for example, contributes, I think, approximately about 75% of the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council budget. And in that context, one can be able to see that as long as Africa's economy is not powerful, Africa's military might is not powerful, Africa's politics are also not powerful, I don't foresee a situation whereby Africans would be able to contribute much towards reforming or democratizing the United Nations Security Council. I mean, if you look at the Libyan case, for example, if you look
Yes.
at the Zimbabwean case, for example, you remember the Libyan case in 2011, where South Africa voted for a no-fly zone and military intervention in Libya. And Libya was
Yes.
one of Africa's success stories. And look at what is happening right now in Libya. If you look at what happened in 2008, where the United Nations was trying to find a collective approach to the Zimbabwean situation. You had South Africa, Russia, and China that blocked that resolution. The issue here is not whether the resolution was justified or not, but the issue is around the question of the veto power and the systems that are in place in terms of the in terms of the United Nations Security Council. So when we look at the countries that have been part of the Security Council as non-permanent members, for those 2 years, stipulated by the laws and the norms of the United Nations Security Council, you would realize that some of these countries, such as South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda, they represent what one would regard as a complementary approach in terms of politics and economics. And other conservatives would then argue to say, what would be the criterion that would be used in the event that we get to that stage where African states can be part of the permanent members in the United Nations Security Council? And you would guess that probably it would be South Africa, it would be Nigeria, it would be in Kenya, for example, because these are regional powerhouses. But in terms of advancing Pan-Africanist interests, it would be then a conversation for another day. And you would then go back to the Israeli consensus of the African Union of 2005, where the African Union declared that it would be working in cahoots with the United Nations when it comes to some of the thematic concerns on the African continent. One of them was that the African Union had a challenge with the veto power and also the selection of members into the non-permanent seats in the Security Council, because already you could see a divergence in terms of views, where seemingly the African continent would say, in as much as South Africa can be a regional powerhouse, in as much as Kenya can be a regional powerhouse and Nigeria can be a powerhouse, in terms of political orientation, it's more liberal than it is African. It's more capitalist than it is maybe Pan-Africanist, for a better word.
Interesting, Doc. Analysis there, excellent analysis. So now one begins to wonder if I knew well, it's a matter of looking at it and what exactly you're looking at. But I think from what you are saying, from the submissions that you've made, Africa is not ready to become a member to be considered a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, because, for example, there is also one issue that we might also want to look into the of even how the African Union functions. Look at it. Is it functioning well? Is it working in the way it's supposed to work? Is the unity? Is it efficient? Is it effective? Because for us, like what you said, I think you made a very good point when you talked about charity beginning at home before we go out there. Now we are talking about a seat in the United Nations Security Council, but when we look back at home, yes, you mentioned Zimbabwe, what's happening in Zimbabwe. You mentioned what is happening in Mozambique. But now, even if you look at us as a continent, there seems to be no coherence. There seems to be no unity. There seems to be even the African Union itself. It has problems. It has big problems of its own. That also, I think, brings into question whether or not we are ready to become a member of such an entity. So, at the end of the day, should we say we are beating a dead horse?
I wouldn't really say that it's a fool's errand, on the
Yeah.
basis that I think when we are looking at Africa's foreign policy making and
Mhm.
international relations, there are so many things that we need to take into account. One of
Okay.
them being that Africa's foreign policy is a province of elite leaders. Africa's
Mhm.
foreign policy also has certain aspects such as context, sources, and maybe sites, for example. So I'll try to break down these four aspects that I've raised. The first one being that Africa's foreign policy making is a province of leaders, where we are looking at charismatic leaders in the case of Robert Mugabe, in the case of Kwame Nkrumah, and all these leaders that were very much instrumental in the internationalization of the African agenda. And these fall into the category of the first generation of leaders who some would argue were driven by ideologies because of the historical experiences and institutional memories that they had with regards to our relations with other superpowers such as Britain, France, who by virtue of history were colonial masters. And we go to the question of also context. And I think the context through which the calls for the reforming of the United Nations Security Council is derived from a unipolar system where America became a hegemonic superpower. And most of these weak states, particularly in the third world, they were relegated to a dichotomized international system, them against us. You look at the bipolar context of the Cold War. So these are some of the issues that uh, create the necessary environments for the formulation of foreign policy. You also look at source being basically the ideological underpinnings of African foreign policy making. The ideological underpinnings calling for the reforming of the United Nations Security Council. And you also look at sites where foreign policy is formulated. In Africa, you'll find that there are certain institutions such as your military, former liberation movements that are now in power, pressure groups, civic organizations, you name it, that are very much influential. Now, when you take all these issue factors that I've raised, you look at how far can we go in terms of reforming the Security Council. But also earlier on, as you would recall, that I raised the question that in terms of whether Africa can reform the United Nations or it can be assimilated into the Security Council, it depends on the context and the theoretical underpinnings from which one is what is arguing. If it is from a Marxist point of view, I do not think that this is a fool's errand, because one way or the other, the contentious contestations between the global north and the global south will continue to be there for the longest period of time and in the foreseeable future. But if one is looking at it from, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Go on.
Yes, if one is looking at it from a realist point of view, you'd think and assume that it is a fool's errand. But if it is from a liberal point of view, I think we have a case. I think Africa should claim its position in international relations and in the international system. So it depends on which angle one is arguing their case.
Interesting. I, I hear you. It depends with the theoretical underpinning using and the context you are using to look at the whole issue. Well, so in other words, I mean, I also have one question that I want to ask you about the issue of this crop of leaders. We have been talking about the first crop of leaders. We are talking about the ones
Yes.
maybe from the 1960s going onwards, of which many of them are no longer on the scene. Do you have faith in the current crop of generation? Do you think maybe, I know you have already pinpointed how they are, how different they are from the first crop of leaders, but do you have any prospects that maybe they can pursue the reform of the United Nations Security Council on the aspect of the permanent membership, given that they are not as reformist like the first crop of leaders? Do you have any hope? Do you have any prospects that maybe they will carry on as fierce and as robust as the first crop of leaders?
I think, you see, there are scholars such as Stuart Hall who talk of identities being in a constant state of mobility, in the sense that the issues that we used to discuss in Africa around the 1960s, I don't think if they are still relevant in 2021. And I think because of generational consensus, each and every generation has certain objectives, certain ideological consensus, political consensus, and economic consensus. And I think we are now in the age of multilateralism. We are now in an age of multipolar system where we are seeing emerging powers such as China, India, and Brazil, and Japan, for a better word. And I think we need to approach this from a sober point of view, and not necessarily to have a Pan-Africanist amnesia where we think that the first generations of leaders such as President Mugabe, President Mandela, President Samora Machel were the alpha and omega of Africa's foreign policy and practice of international relations. I think we need to be people who accept that each and every generation is capable of formulating what is in the best interest of Africa. And I think the second and third generations of leaders, basically, they are moving away from hard politics to soft politics that are more liberal in orientation and multilateral in approach, which I think if we are to use that template, we will go far in as far as realizing Africa's objective and Africa's place in the community of nations is concerned.
Okay, interesting. I think you have touched on much. You've touched much on various aspects in terms of the questions that I had for you. But maybe, so in terms of the young people, what do you have to say to them? Should we continue to, because you see, we also have young people like myself who would like to call themselves Pan-Africanists, who would like to call themselves, that kind of leadership that wants Africa to have its position, a greater position. Because one thing that we have to remember also about the UN Security Council is Africa is probably one of the most affected in terms of the decisions that are made by the United Nations Security Council. Are you
Yes.
Yes. I was saying that when we look at even our membership to the UN, and also we're looking at how African countries are probably the most affected by the decisions that are made by the UN Security Council. What would you have us do as young people regarding this issue of this fight for a permanent seat? Should we let it go? Should we insist? What should we do as far as the UN is concerned? Because the UN remains important, and the UN Security Council becomes very important because it is the one that makes, it is the highest board that makes binding decisions, and those decisions African countries are the most affected. So I don't know, what would be your advice to the young people? What should we do? Should we pursue even in the future? Is it something that we must continue to pursue, or it's something that maybe too high to pursue? I understand you talked about the issue of depends how you're looking at it. It depends if you're looking from the realist perspective, if you're looking at it from the Marxist perspective. But maybe in your opinion, what would you have us do?
Well, you see, I think I'm going to be very biased on that, on the question of youth and youth in politics. Why? Because let's look at our African political systems. Our political systems are basically patriarchal in orientation, where the older generations basically does not trust us in as far as we are capable of running affairs. And there is a tendency amongst us as Africans to borrow so much from Western political processes, Western ideologies, and one of them being that as youths, we are ready to govern. But if you look at these mature democracies, your America, Britain, you name it, they have old people that are running those countries. And I think they are doing very well. So it's a question of ethics and management, whether in terms of ethics and management, as African youths, we are ready to have a discussion around our readiness to reform the African continent and our readiness even to reform and democratize the United Nations Security Council. In my view, it's not really a matter of age, but it's a matter of ethics. Do we have those ethics that are lacking? But of course, I think in the African experience, the question of whether our youths should negotiate political space, it borders on the fact that we are recovering from political fatigue. We are recovering from political traumatic experiences of being led by the older generation that seemingly is degenerating our politics into apathy, corruption, and mismanagement. And this self-entitled mentality that they have, that somehow they still have that colonial hangover and they feel that we still owe them. But the question that I would pose is, if we as youths, for example, we are talking about reforming the United Security Council, what type of reforms are we talking about? Yeah. Are we seeking to assimilate Africa into the broader international processes that constitute and determine the United Nations Security Council, or we are seeking to reform it, to revolutionize it in such a way that it is favorable, it is distributed in an equitable manner? Which brings to the next question, that if it's a matter of reforming it, it is the question of whether we have the political and socio-economic capacities, resources to be able to reform. Because some of the states that are policing the world, America, they have the military resources, political capital to contribute. That is one thing that we also look at. If it's a question of assimilating Africa into the United Nations Security Council, then we are talking about cohesive diplomacy. We are talking about the carrot and stick type of approach, whereby us Africans as weaker states, you go to the United Nations Security Council, they say that no, we have to militarily intervene into Mozambique to deal with insurgency. And then for some reasons, Burkina Faso is told that you have to support this resolution for us to give you COVID vaccines, I mean. So these are some of the limitations of Africa's foreign policy expression, because it is lacking that economic flavor, and of which you would know that economic flavor is part and parcel of the formulation of any country's foreign policy. So in my submission, these are issues that as youth would also have to discuss in a sober manner, whether this is a complete reformation of the United Nations Security Council, or we are seeking to accommodate each other to coexist with the big and superpowers of the world.
Thank you, Doc. I was expecting a number of questions, but I have quite some beautiful feedback from our viewers. I have Blessing Makurua who says, and I also have Bernard Muzingwani. He says, deep analysis, Dr. Mangani. Charity begins at home. Unfortunately, in Africa, it ends there. Domestic politics. And then I also have Miss Vito, who says, great analysis, Doc. And of course, I have Agai Mafuta, who says, I am connected. And Dr. The other one, he just says, I take it that it's a he. He says, Dr. D. Mangani. And then I also have Jackson Wachira, who says, thanks for this session, which is timely, truly homegrown politics and development. However, how opposed it will be by hegemonic powers is what is needed to propel us to the next levels. That's what I have so far, Doc. I want to say a very big thank you for wonderful submissions. Maybe what I would also ask before maybe you give your closing remarks is maybe in terms of feasibility. I don't know if you mentioned how maybe our fight may be affected by the fight that will also be put by those who would like to maintain the status quo. Because like you said, if you're looking at it from the realist perspective, this is supposed to be an instrument. The UN Security Council is supposed to be an instrument that is supposed to achieve foreign policy objectives, especially of the big powers or the great powers that make up the UN Security Council. So I don't know what you think about maybe the fight that will be also put, because there are those who really benefit from the way things are in terms of power distribution, in terms of even how the power is balanced right now in this setup in the international system.
In my final submission, I would want to invite you to look at what is the current political trajectories in Africa. Yes. We have a crisis that has been going on in Zimbabwe for the past 2 decades.
Yes.
And the international community, particularly SADC and the African Union, as our guarantors, they seemingly have grown political fatigue. Mm-hmm. And they seem to be not to be in a hurry to find a permanent solution to the Zimbabwean crisis.
Yes.
Just next door in Mozambique, we have ISIS, if it's not Al-Shabaab, that is wreaking havoc. Mm-hmm. And we had to wait for a foreign power in the form of America to intervene into Mozambique. Yet SADC, brother liberation movements and sister presidents, they haven't said anything or come up with a resolution to that. We have a crisis that has been going on, I think, for 3 decades in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Up in the Maghreb region, we have a crisis in Libya. In the Horn of Africa, we have a crisis in Sudan. We have a crisis in South Sudan. And when you look at all these regions that make up Africa, we also have a crisis in West Africa, in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, Boko Haram. And you look at all these crises, and the continent is not in a position to invoke the African peer review mechanisms by the African Union, the African Union Security Council, is not in a position to invoke some of its statutory and legal instruments to police these governments that are in power to find an inclusive and democratic space. Now, one would imagine that what is it that we are going to export to the United Nations Security Council if in our backyards we are not in a position to be able to discuss and deal with some of these issues? Of course, there are various factors that are at play. Some of them are external factors, the question of sanctions, the question of foreign interference, neocolonialism, you name it. But also at the same time, if we go back to the genesis of the United Nations and Security Council in 1945, you would realize that the Security Council was formed and it was structured in such a way that would protect the victors of the Second World War, your Russia, your America, Britain, and France. And it was aimed at responding to a foreseeable threat of Germany. So it was almost as if they were trying to preempt Germany. And as you would, as time would go on in 1965, where they introduced the UN Charter that looked at accommodating and increasing the membership, you'd look at it was now predicated along Cold War lenses. And this call around reforming the United Nations Security Council, it is also found within the context of a post-Cold War, where we have the Fukuyamian discourse of the end of history and the last man standing of the Americans. And you'd realize that countries such as Russia, countries such as China have been sponsoring the likes of Brazil, Germany, Japan, and India as the G4 to call for the reformation of the Security Council. So I don't see anywhere in the history of the world where we are saying the United Nations Security Council should be reformed in order to maintain peace and security of the world. But I think it serves the interests of these superpowers. So in conclusion, I don't foresee the United Nations reforming, particularly involving even permanent members and invoking the realist theoretical argument. Members, remember, they voluntarily join organizations. They are not bound by the decisions of the UN. These are on a voluntary basis because the state is the most important actor and unit of analysis in international relations, relations. So we cede our sovereignty to these to these organizations on a voluntary basis. That is why you would recall prior to the 2013 elections, if I still recall, where President Robert Mugabe threatened to pull out of SADC on the basis that SADC was seemingly no longer saving the interest of Zimbabwe. So as a result, the president felt that no, we can pull out. And you'd remember that even the International Court of Justice Criminal Court, democracies such as America have not ratified that. Recently, the US President Joe Biden had to uplift the sanctions that were imposed by the previous president, Donald Trump. So it tells you that the state is more important. The state commands determine foreign policy than these organizations such as United Nations, which pessimists would regard as toothless bulldogs. Thank you so much.
There you have it. There you have it. The state is the most important actor in international relations, in international affairs. Doc, before I let you go, just one more, a brief one. Makurua, he is asking, okay, first he asks and says, I would like to ask an inside question. How do you think Africa can liberate itself from economic dependency? Is water broadly still relevant? Explanation. And then he goes on to say, just after that question, he goes on to say, it follows from the view that for Africa to fully participate in the global arena representing true African needs, it has to be able to finance, to fund its own voice. So there you have it, Doc. You can go ahead and answer Blessing there.
I think Dr. Designate Mukuruwa has raised very interesting analysis. I would want to invoke the Chinese model and see if it fits in our African experience. You would recall that around the 1970s, China was a third world, had a third world status in terms of its economy. Its industry was backward. It was relying on agriculture, exporting, and all these things. But the Chinese model, what they did was to liberalize their economies and centralize their politics to capture the state in terms of politics, but to open up the economy to investments, development, and all these other things. And I think if we are able to look at that, I think we can be able to develop. For example, if you look at the Chinese Communist Party in terms of cadre deployment and state capture, if I sit on the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, for example, I receive party and ideological orientation from a political point of view. For me to toe the party line, for me to be able to deploy it in key institutions or ministries. But when I fell in the portfolio of international relations, instead of them assigning me to the Ministry of Finance that I have no idea or knowledge about or academic background, they sent me again to the Communist Party for ideological training so that I get it right. But in Africa, what happens? If I belong to Chama Chama Pinduzi and I sit in the Politburo, and because I have a background in political science and international relations, I am deployed to head the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if I fail to formulate Tanzania's foreign policy, instead of taking me back for ideological orientation, taking me back for efficiency purposes, at the end of the day, I'm assigned to another ministry. Why? Because Yanano dances too much, because Yanano is the muscle of the party. So we need to do away with big man syndromes. We need to do away with identity politics. And I think we need to infuse ethics in politics. We also need to focus on knowledge economies. Unfortunately, I'm not an economist and my knowledge is limited, but the little that I know is that we need to build on knowledge economies. We also need to be able to respect our academics and technocrats, because one of the challenges that we have in Africa is the question of cadre deployment that waters down on accountability, that waters down on meritocracy, because people are selected or are deployed based on kleptocracy, nepotism, and all these other things. So I think for Africa to then have a voice, to not to depend on Europeans or the global north, we need to have leaders with visions, leaders who are able to say, in 20 years' time, what is it that we expect, we hope to achieve for the African continent? And not necessarily to say, yesterday we had an election, tomorrow we are going to focus. We're now beginning to focus on elections. I've been working with the New Nation Movement, and the New Nation Movement is in the process of trying to reform the Electoral Act of South Africa, which says that because the previous Electoral Act barred independent candidates from contesting for elections. But the alternative electoral model that is coming in is a multi-member constituency based, where the citizens have the right to choose candidates of their own choice, to choose technocrats, to choose people that would represent them in parliament based on meritocracy, and not because you belong to a certain party and therefore your mandate is directed by political parties. So I think when we reform our electoral acts, when we reform our politics, and when we reform even our economics, we are in a better position to deliver on the Africa that we want.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Doc. I hope Mr. Dr. Designate Blessing Makurua has got his answer there. Doc, I want to say a very big thank you. Thank you for being with us. You know, like they say, all good things, even good things too, they have to come to an end. So I want to say a very big thank you to you for being with us. I've learned a lot. It's like what Emmanuel Mangani said. This was deep analysis. This was deep analysis. I mean, at some point, I felt like, please, Doc, can you just break, it down so that at least the common, the common individual can have also the same appreciation that maybe those that have an understanding of the language are also having. But it was crystal clear. It was superb. Thank you for your submissions. I have learned a lot. I've learned about how it is important when it comes to analyzing this whole issue, when it comes to answering the issues, the questions involved, how it is important to consider where you are viewing this whole question from, whether you're looking at it from the realist perspective, whether you're looking at it from the Marxist perspective. But like you said, I think the one thing that I would definitely carry home, and I hope someone else will carry home, is the fact that Africa has a lot to do. Africa has to work on itself. There's so much that we need to do. Like you mentioned what is happening in Zimbabwe, how Africa is failing to resolve such kind of issues, what is happening in Mozambique and many other parts of Africa. And you mentioned how it is important for us to reform, to come up with reform so that at least we are able to be in a position that maybe we can even be considered to take such big responsibility. Thank you again, Doc. Have a beautiful and wonderful night. Good night, Doc. Thank you for joining me on Africa in Perspective online conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for this opportunity.
Powerful. Good night, Doc. Bye-bye to you. Bye-bye to you. There it was, ladies and gentlemen. That was Dr. Mangani. Powerful, powerful submissions. Today, the question that was before us, the topic that was before us, is Africa's fight for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, background, feasibility, and prospects for success. I want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss future conversations. Do not forget to like us and follow us on all our social media platforms. From Africa in Perspective online conversations, and for myself, it is a bye-bye for now. Good night to you.